Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Saul Newton and the Sullivanians? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, then I'll offer my analysis. Saul Newton was born in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, on June 25, 1906. He attended the University of Wisconsin and the University of Chicago. In college, Saul started to develop extreme left-wing beliefs. He considered himself to be a communist. Saul fought in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II. When his service was complete, he informally studied psychotherapy. At some point, Saul married a woman named Dr. Jane Pierce. Unlike Saul, she did have formal training in psychotherapy. Saul and Jane worked at an institute in New York City that was co-founded by a well-known psychiatrist and psychoanalyst named Harry Stack Sullivan. Harry had a number of beliefs that influenced Saul. A few examples: Harry believed that personality could never be isolated from the family and the environment. He believed that mental illness was mostly caused by cultural forces. He thought of loneliness as the most painful of all human experiences, and, despite being a psychiatrist, he was generally against psychiatry. He inspired a number of anti-psychiatry psychotherapists. Harry died in 1949. 8 years later, in 1957, Saul and Jane established the Sullivan Institute for Research in Psychoanalysis. This was also in New York City. They distorted a number of Harry's theories and promoted versions of his philosophy that were so extreme they were barely recognizable. Saul believed that the traditional family was the primary cause of mental illness, including anxiety. He sought to destroy the traditional family and strongly believed that this aligned with his far-left progressive views. Saul started building what would eventually be considered a cult. Over the next several years, he would recruit many members. They lived in 3 buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. At its peak, the cult had about 500 members. Many members were intellectuals and artists. Almost all of them had adopted far-left political values, were well-educated, secular, and had liberal views about sex. Saul developed a number of rules that cult members had to follow. A few examples: exclusive relationships were not permitted without special approval from Saul. Saul didn't think children should be primarily raised by their parents. They were sent to boarding schools or were raised by caretakers. They would only see their parents for 1 hour a day and 1 evening a week. Members of the cult were not allowed to have contact with their family members, although they were allowed to ask family members for money. They were actually encouraged to do this. Members had to participate in 3 psychotherapy sessions per week. This was a major part of the indoctrination and helped Saul maintain control over his followers. Eventually, Saul and his team of psychotherapists would tell members who they were going to be in a relationship with. As time went on, Saul exercised an increasing level of control over the members. Eventually, Saul and Jane divorced. Saul married a soap opera actress named Joan Harvey. In total, Saul would marry and divorce 6 times and have 4 sons and 6 daughters. After marrying Joan Harvey, Saul became increasingly authoritarian. Saul and his wife opened a politically progressive theater collective called the Fourth Wall Repertory Company. In 1978, the theater signed a lease for a building in the East Village. The problem is, the current occupant, another theater company, refused to leave the building. Saul sent hundreds of his cult members to destroy the other theater company's sets. 3 members were arrested. After the partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1979, Saul had a full meltdown and became convinced that Manhattan was going to be destroyed. He thought that it would be safer for the cult to relocate to Orlando, Florida. 250 cult members decided to go with Saul. The others remained in New York. A few weeks later, Saul decided that Manhattan was safe after all. The followers who had left for Florida returned. Those who had remained in New York were ostracized. because they were viewed as disloyal to Saul Newton. One cult member said that he tried to leave the group in 1985. 2 cult members were sent by Saul to attack him, which they did when they caught up with the member at a subway stop in Union Square. The attackers held him over the subway tracks, threatening to let him get hit by a train if he did not return to the cult. The victim said that those 2 attackers went on to become successful professionals in New York. They were never prosecuted. One worked for the New York Times, and the other was a professor at Columbia University. The victim, as well as another member, sued the cult, which brought attention to some of the cult's controversial practices. For the next several years, Saul Newton became increasingly paranoid. He had members build a steel-lined room in a resort in the Catskills. He did this because he believed the CIA was conducting surveillance on him. In 1991, Saul Newton died from sepsis. This effectively ended the cult. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few items that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1, Saul had a tremendous contempt for traditional family values. A key part of his strategy was to keep children away from their parents. This led to a number of lawsuits later in his life and after his death. Saul felt as though if a parent was taking care of a child, that child would create emotional bonds and dependencies. Children were rotated among adults throughout the week to prevent this from happening. One way that the cult earned money was through fines that Saul would assess on members. If a parent expressed too much interest in their children, that was a $10,000 fine. Item number 2, like most cults, sex was a major focus of the ideology. Saul believed that monogamy needed to be destroyed. He wanted the members to have sex with as many different other members as possible. They were ordered not to refuse sex from any member who requested it. Saul personally had sex with many of his followers. If he noticed that another man was particularly attracted to a specific woman, he would have sex with that woman to teach the man a lesson about the dangers of focusing on one romantic interest. The psychotherapist in the group had sex with cult followers as well. They did not worry about ethics, possibly because few of them were actually qualified to be psychotherapists in the first place. Item number 3, sex was not only a popular activity for the members, it was a major recruiting tool for the cult. One of the group's more popular events was a series of Saturday night parties they would hold on Long Island. At the parties, sex was very easy to find, as in pretty much a 100% chance of success. When the AIDS crisis hit in the mid-1980s, the group struggled to grow the membership ranks as people were more concerned about having multiple partners. Item number 4, the top tier of group leadership was made up exclusively of psychotherapists, or at least people that called themselves psychotherapists. This included Saul Newton and a few other individuals. The next tier of leadership was made up of people who were training to be therapists. Therapy sessions represented a crucial control tactic for the cult. During the sessions, a member could expect to be heavily criticized. For example, the therapist might tell them that they were evil and their mother did not like them. A key objective of therapy was to convince the member to hate their own mother. Saul believed that mothers were the root of all mental illness. So I guess Mother's Day was like his Mental Health Awareness Day. Saul felt about Mother's Day like the Grinch felt about Christmas. As far as confidentiality between the therapist and the client, it was straightforward in the sense that it didn't exist. Therapists would routinely share secrets with other members, sometimes in a deliberate effort to embarrass clients. The psychotherapist would also recruit spies. They would ask members to report violations of the cult rules. The net result of the so-called therapeutic activity was a group that was completely under the control of cult leadership. There was no privacy, no safety, and no comfort. The followers were always looking over their shoulders. They were always being watched. Item number 5, in addition to controlling romantic and sexual behavior, childcare, and therapy attendance, the cult controlled other aspects of the members' lives. For example, they were told which hobbies they could engage in and which ones they had to avoid, and they were issued directions about which jobs they could take. Working was an important part of life in the cult. It paid the bills and made Saul wealthy. Eventually, the group accumulated $12 million in real estate alone. Item number 6, Saul Newton had unusual mental health symptoms and personality characteristics. Saul appeared to be both psychopathic and narcissistic. From psychopathy, he was manipulative, callous, cold, lacked empathy, and had superficial charm. From narcissism, he was envious, grandiose, arrogant, socially dominant, overconfident, and had fantasies of success and power. Toward the end of his life, it appears as though he became paranoid and psychotic. As far as the 5-factor model, Saul was high in openness to experience. He was creative and intellectually curious. He had mid-range conscientiousness. He wasn't particularly cautious, but in some areas he was well organized. He had high extroversion. He was sensation-seeking and talkative. Low agreeableness. He was not modest or straightforward. And he had high neuroticism. He was angry and could not resist temptation. Item number 7. Like many cults, when the group disbands, many of the members go on to be quite successful. For example, those 2 members who allegedly attacked another member in the subway went on to have great careers. Once the influence of the cult is broken, most people will return to normal or close to normal. In addition, some people will deny that they were ever in a cult. It's like they just want to make the whole situation go away, or they want to view it in a way that was different than reality. Some of these Sullivanians had good memories from their time in Manhattan. They believe that the cult has been unfairly vilified. Item number 8 is the extreme left-wing ideology of this cult. Many cults are not sophisticated enough to be consistently driven by a cohesive political ideology. The members will say that they are promoting some type of political value, but in reality, the cults are simply too disorganized to follow through, and their political views are inconsistent, ever-changing, or nonsensical. For example, the Heaven's Gate cult thought that aliens from outer space were coming to pick them up. Despite the fact that some political party leaders may seem like aliens from outer space, I'm not aware of any political party that runs on the alien pickup premise. Cults that identify as left-wing often appeal to those who want to destroy the current system, like they want a revolution. Cults that identify as right-wing are typically based on religious views. They are often preparing for the end of the world. Saul Newton claimed that the Sullivanians were left-wing. They were promoting a world that did not have traditional family values, law and order, or democracy. Saul may have destroyed those elements inside of his cult, but the group never made any true effort to promote political values outside of itself. I think that all of Saul's political discussions were really just a way to make his strategies seem like they were based on something more than just his own desires. Saul formed the cult so that he could have power and as much sex as he wanted. Saul claimed that he was a visionary who unified politics and psychology, but in reality, he unified gullible members with pain and suffering. Now moving to the last item, number 9. Here I will go through the 7 criteria for a cult and compare them to the behavior of the Sullivanians. A cult is authoritarian and manipulative. This cult clearly contains both of those elements. It uses mind control strategies. This cult had a novel psychotherapy-based mind control strategy that worked very well. It tends to target middle-class citizens. The Sullivanians were mostly from middle and upper class. It is based around communal goals. This is true for the Sullivanians. They all wanted to destroy traditional family values. A cult uses aggressive conversion methods. I'm not sure this cult really needed to resort to that extreme, but they certainly used aggressive methods to retain members, like threatening to have them struck by a train. A cult indoctrinates members using a system. The Sullivanians had a fairly sophisticated system, which included regular therapy sessions and distinct leadership levels. The last criterion is the cult employs a relatively new belief system in the culture of origin. I think that the Sullivanians' belief system was not only new in its culture of origin, but something that has not been seen anywhere before. I'm not aware of any other cult based on psychotherapy in this way. Now moving to my final thoughts. People often seek out cults because they're unhappy with the current political climate or stressful conditions in society. They seek a utopia, a place where all the established social and moral principles do not apply. They quickly learn that the alternative to those principles is a dictator. The members only trade one set of difficulties for problems that are much worse. Those are my thoughts on Saul Newton and the Sullivanians. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.